My name is Marcus Chen. I'm 39 years old, and for 12 years I was a senior intelligence analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency. I've sat in windowless rooms analyzing threats that could topple governments. I've briefed senators on classified operations that the public will never know existed. I've decoded messages that prevented attacks on American soil. And I've lost sleep over intelligence that arrived just hours too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But none of that training prepared me for the voicemail I received from my own mother on a Tuesday morning in November. Her voice was cold, clinical, the way it always became when she was delivering what she considered unpleasant news. Marcus, your father and I have discussed it. We don't think it's appropriate for you to attend Sarah's engagement party this weekend. It would be uncomfortable for everyone. I'm sure you understand. I played the message 3 times, standing in my small apartment kitchen, the morning light filtering through blinds that never quite closed properly. There was no explanation, no specific reason given, just the familiar dismissal I'd grown accustomed to over the years. The subtext was clear as always. You don't belong here. You never have. I deleted the message and finished my coffee in silence. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with that old, familiar weight of being unwanted. My sister Sarah was getting engaged to a hedge fund manager from Greenwich. The kind of man my parents could introduce at country club dinners, without having to explain anything complicated about his career or his loyalties. The thing about being a CIA analyst is that you learn to read between the lines of everything. Every conversation becomes a puzzle to decode. Every silence carries meaning. When my mother said uncomfortable for everyone, she meant uncomfortable for them. Having a son whose job they couldn't discuss at cocktail parties, whose work required security clearances they didn't understand, whose life existed in a world they found both threatening and embarrassing. I wasn't the son they had planned for. I wasn't the investment banker like my sister's fiancé, or the corporate lawyer like my cousin David, or the real estate developer like my father. I was the one who disappeared for months at a time on assignments I couldn't discuss, who spoke languages they'd never heard of, who came home with a tension in my shoulders and shadows under my eyes that made family dinners feel like interrogations. The engagement party was being held at the Metropolitan Club in Manhattan, the same venue where my parents had celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. I knew the place well, had attended enough family functions there to recognize the particular echo of voices in the main dining room, the way the crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the white tablecloths. I could have stayed home, could have accepted the dismissal with the same quiet resignation I'd practiced for years. Instead, I found myself standing outside the club at 6:30 that evening, wearing my best suit, watching through the tall windows as familiar faces gathered inside. I wasn't there to cause a scene or to force myself into spaces where I wasn't wanted. I was there because something inside me had finally grown tired of being erased. The doorman recognized me from previous events, offering a polite nod as I approached. "Good evening, Mr. Chen. Here for the Morrison engagement party?" Morrison was my mother's maiden name, the one she'd kept hyphenated, the one that carried weight in social circles where my father's Chinese surname still drew curious glances despite 40 years of marriage. I nodded and stepped inside, the familiar scent of old leather and expensive perfume wrapping around me like a memory I couldn't quite shake. The lobby buzzed with that particular energy of well-dressed people celebrating good news, voices layered over the soft clink of champagne glasses and restrained laughter. I spotted them almost immediately. My parents stood near the bar, my mother elegant in navy blue, my father distinguished in his charcoal gray suit. They were surrounded by the usual circle of family friends, their faces animated as they discussed Sarah's upcoming wedding plans, the venue in the Hamptons, the dress designer they'd flown in from Paris. My sister Sarah glowed beside her fiancé, her left hand catching the light as she gestured, the engagement ring sparkling like a small constellation on her finger. She looked happy, genuinely radiant in a way that made my chest tighten with something between affection and loss. We'd been close once, before careers and geography and family expectations had pulled us into different orbits. I moved through the crowd slowly, accepting congratulations from distant relatives who weren't quite sure what I did for work but knew it was something important in Washington. Their conversations felt like performances, polite scripts we'd all memorized to avoid the awkwardness of genuine connection. That's when I saw my Aunt Patricia approaching, her expression shifting from surprise to something sharper when she spotted me. Patricia had never approved of my career choice, had made it clear at every family gathering that she considered intelligence work unseemly, somehow beneath the family standards. She was my mother's older sister, a woman who measured worth in country club memberships and charitable board positions. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to catch the attention of nearby conversations. "I'm surprised to see you here. I thought, well, your mother mentioned you might be traveling for work." The lie landed heavily between us, obvious to anyone paying attention. I could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way conversations paused and eyes began to turn in our direction. My parents had stopped talking, their faces frozen in expressions I recognized from childhood, the look they wore when I'd done something that required damage control. "No travel this week," I replied quietly, keeping my voice level. "Just wanted to congratulate Sarah and meet her fiancé." Patricia's smile grew thinner. "Of course. Though I do hope you understand how important this evening is for the family. Sarah's engagement is such a blessing, and Thomas comes from such a wonderful background. We wouldn't want anything to complicate the celebration." The word complicate hung in the air like a blade. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the old muscle memory of being made to feel like a burden, an embarrassment, a problem that needed to be managed. Around us, conversations had resumed, but I could feel the sideways glances, the whispered questions about why there was tension surrounding the mysterious government worker who never quite fit in. My mother appeared at Patricia's shoulder, her face carefully composed but her eyes sharp with warning. "Marcus, darling, what a surprise. I thought you'd received my message about tonight being family only." The dismissal was surgical in its precision, delivered with just enough sweetness to maintain plausible deniability, while making the rejection absolutely clear. Family only. As if I were somehow separate from the very people who had raised me, as if my career had transformed me into something foreign and unwelcome. I looked around the room, at the faces I'd known since childhood, at the life I'd been systematically excluded from over the years. The weight of it settled over me like fog, thick and suffocating. I could leave. I could walk away with whatever dignity remained intact, except the role they'd assigned me as the family outsider whose work was too complicated, too dangerous, too different for their carefully curated world. But something had changed in me over the years of classified briefings and late-night threat assessments, something that had learned to recognize the difference between genuine security concerns and simple prejudice. This wasn't about protecting the family or maintaining appropriate boundaries. This was about shame, about their inability to reconcile the son they'd raised with the man I'd become. I straightened my shoulders, a gesture that had become automatic after years of standing in rooms where my analysis could determine the fate of nations. "I'm here to celebrate Sarah," I said simply, my voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the polite veneer of their dismissal. "I'm her brother, and I'm proud of her." The silence that followed felt different than the usual awkward pauses that punctuated our family interactions. This silence had weight, consequence, the electric tension that comes when unspoken truths finally demand acknowledgement. I could see my sister across the room, her expression caught between confusion and something that might have been recognition, as if she was finally seeing the dynamics that had shaped our family for years. That's when I noticed him, standing near the entrance to the main dining room, scanning the crowd with the particular alertness that I recognized immediately. Director William Harrison, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the man who had personally approved my most sensitive assignments, who had sat across from me in the Oval Office during crisis briefings that would never appear in any public record. He wasn't supposed to be here, had no reason to be at a private engagement party in Manhattan. But there he was, and the moment our eyes met across the crowded room, I felt the entire trajectory of the evening shift towards something I could never have anticipated. Director Harrison moved through the crowd with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, his presence somehow both understated and unmistakable. He wore a simple black suit, nothing flashy, but there was something in his bearing that made conversations pause as he passed. I watched him navigate the room, accepting polite nods from guests who clearly had no idea who he was, just another well-dressed man at an Upper East Side social gathering. My mother had noticed him too, her social radar finely tuned to identify anyone who might enhance or threaten the evening's carefully orchestrated perfection. She excused herself from her conversation with Patricia and began moving in his direction, no doubt preparing to introduce herself and determine his connection to the guest list. I found myself frozen in place, my mind racing through the implications of his presence here. The director didn't attend social events without reason. Every minute of his schedule was planned weeks in advance, every appearance calculated for maximum strategic value. His being here meant something, and that something was almost certainly connected to me. The realization hit me like ice water. Someone had told him about tonight. Someone in the intelligence community had learned about my family's latest rejection and decided it warranted intervention at the highest levels. The thought made my stomach clench with a mixture of gratitude and humiliation. I had spent years building a reputation as someone who could handle any crisis, who could maintain operational security under the most extreme pressure, and now I was the analyst who needed rescue from his own family. As I watched my mother approach the director, memory pulled me backward to another evening, another moment when my two worlds had collided with devastating results. It was 3 years ago, during what should have been a celebration of my father's retirement from his law firm. The partners had thrown an elaborate dinner at the plaza, complete with speeches about his distinguished career and presentations of crystal awards that would gather dust on office shelves. I had been deep undercover for 8 months at that point, embedded in a network of arms dealers operating between Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The operation was so classified that even my direct supervisor didn't know all the details. I spoke perfect Russian and passable Arabic, had learned to move through gray markets and black sites with the fluid adaptability that had made me valuable to the agency. The extraction had been sudden and brutal. Intelligence suggested our cover was blown, that several assets were compromised, and that I had perhaps 6 hours before my identity was discovered. I made it home with 40 minutes to spare before my father's dinner, still carrying the weight of 8 months of deception in my bones, still hearing voices in languages that weren't English echoing in my head. I remember standing in the plaza's bathroom, staring at my reflection in the marble-framed mirror, trying to transform myself from the person I'd been for the past 8 months back into Marcus Chen, the dutiful son who could make small talk about stock portfolios and vacation homes. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my tie, not from fear, but from the chemical aftermath of sustained adrenaline, the way your body rebels when you finally allow it to recognize how close to the edge you've been living. The dinner was everything my parents had hoped for. Distinguished colleagues told stories about my father's most memorable cases, his reputation for integrity, his dedication to justice. The room filled with laughter and applause, and for brief moments I could almost pretend I belonged there, could almost forget the weight of the encrypted phone in my jacket pocket that could summon me back to the shadows at any moment. That's when Judge Pemberton had approached our table, an old family friend who had known my parents since law school. He was slightly drunk on champagne and nostalgia, his voice carrying more volume than the intimate setting required. "Richard," he had boomed, clapping my father on the shoulder, "you must be so proud of Marcus here. I heard through the grapevine that he's doing important work for the government. Very hush-hush stuff." The temperature at our table seemed to drop 10 degrees. My mother's smile became rigid, her fingers tightening around her wine glass until I worried it might shatter. My father's expression went carefully blank, the look he wore when facing uncomfortable questions from opposing counsel. "Marcus works as a researcher," my mother had said smoothly, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Nothing too exciting. Policy analysis, that sort of thing." Judge Pemberton had laughed, oblivious to the tension he'd created. "Come now, Helen, we all know he's CIA. My brother-in-law works at State, hears things. Says Marcus has quite the reputation in certain circles. He turned to me, eyes bright with curiosity and alcohol. Can't imagine the stories you could tell, son. The places you've been, the things you've seen. I had opened my mouth to deflect, to offer some vague response about the mundane nature of government work, but my father spoke first. His voice was quiet, controlled, but I heard the edge beneath it, sharp as broken glass. Judge Pemberton, I think there's been some confusion. Marcus does work for the government, but nothing nearly as dramatic as what you're suggesting. Just routine analysis. Desk work, mostly. The dismissal was complete, absolute. Not just of my career, but of everything I had sacrificed to build it. The months away from home, the relationships I couldn't maintain, the parts of myself I'd buried so deep that sometimes I forgot they existed. Reduced to desk work, as if the intelligence I'd gathered hadn't prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks, as if the networks I'd infiltrated hadn't saved countless lives. I had excused myself from the table, claiming I needed air, and spent the next 20 minutes standing on the hotel's balcony, looking out over Central Park while my encrypted phone buzzed with urgent messages about the next assignment, the next identity I would need to assume, the next piece of myself I would need to sacrifice for the greater good. When I returned to the dinner, the conversation had moved on to safer topics: golf handicaps, market trends, vacation plans. No one asked where I'd been. No one seemed to notice that I'd left at all. Now, watching Director Harrison navigate my sister's engagement party, I felt that same familiar weight settling over me. The weight of living between worlds, of serving a country that celebrated my work in classified briefings, while my own family treated it as an embarrassment to be managed and minimized. My Aunt Patricia had positioned herself near the bar, holding court with a group of family friends who hung on her every word as she dissected the social dynamics of various Manhattan charity boards. She caught sight of me watching her and raised her eyebrows in a gesture I'd learned to interpret as a warning. Behave yourself. Don't make a scene. Remember your place. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent the last 12 years of my life in rooms where my analysis influenced decisions that affected millions of people. I had briefed presidents and senators, had stood before joint committees and explained threats that could destabilize entire regions. But here, in this room full of people whose biggest concerns were property taxes and country club waiting lists, I was still the family embarrassment who needed to be kept in line. Sarah appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with champagne and excitement, her engagement ring catching the chandelier light as she reached for my arm. "Marcus, I'm so glad you came," she said, and for a moment her voice carried the warmth of the sister I remembered from childhood, before adult responsibilities and family expectations had drawn us into separate orbits. "I wanted to be here," I replied, meaning it. "You look happy, Sarah." "Really happy." She smiled, but I caught the flicker of something else in her expression, a shadow that suggested she was more aware of the evening's undercurrents than she was letting on. "Thomas is wonderful," she said, but her eyes drifted toward our parents, toward the careful distance they maintained from where we stood. "I know Mom and Dad have been difficult lately. About your work, I mean." It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging the elephant that had been trampling through our family dinners for years. I felt a surge of affection for her, mixed with sadness for the conversations we'd never been able to have, the relationship that had been sacrificed to our parents' inability to accept who I'd become. "It's complicated," I said, falling back on the same diplomatic language I used in congressional briefings when the full truth was too classified to share. Sarah nodded, understanding more than I'd expected. "I know you can't talk about it. I know it's important, what you do. I just wish..." She trailed off, her gaze moving past me to where Director Harrison now stood, near the entrance to the main dining room, still scanning the crowd with that alert, analytical attention that marked him as someone accustomed to assessing threats and opportunities in real time. "Who is that man?" she asked quietly. "He's been watching you since he arrived." Before I could answer, my mother's voice cut through the ambient noise of the party, sharp with the particular authority she wielded at social gatherings. "Marcus, could I speak with you for a moment? Privately?" I followed her to a quiet alcove near the coat check, already knowing what was coming. Her face was composed, but her eyes were bright with the anger she kept carefully controlled in public spaces. When she spoke, her voice was low but intense, each word precisely articulated. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," she began, "but I will not have you disrupting Sarah's engagement party with your associates." She gestured subtly toward where Director Harrison stood, still maintaining his position near the dining room entrance. "Whatever this is about, whatever crisis you've brought to our doorstep, it ends now." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. She thought I had orchestrated this, had somehow arranged for my boss to appear at a family event as part of some elaborate manipulation. The fact that she could believe me capable of such calculated disruption revealed everything about how she saw me. Not as her son who had dedicated his life to protecting the country, but as an outsider whose very presence threatened the carefully constructed world she'd built. "Mom," I started, but she cut me off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "No excuses, Marcus. No explanations about classified this or national security that. This is your sister's night, and I will not let you turn it into some kind of spy movie theatrics." She turned to walk away, dismissing me with the same casual authority she'd used when I was 12 years old, and had disappointed her yet again. But as she took her first step back toward the party, Director Harrison's voice carried across the room, calm and clear, and absolutely unmistakable in its authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The conversations died instantly. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips, laughter cut off mid-sentence, and every face in the room turned toward the man who had commanded their attention with nothing more than the quiet authority in his voice. The Metropolitan Club's main reception area, which moments before had buzzed with the animated chatter of a successful engagement party, now held the kind of complete silence that comes when people instinctively recognize they are in the presence of real power. Director Harrison stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sweeping the room with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reading faces, assessing loyalties, identifying threats and allies in the span of seconds. He waited until every conversation had stopped, until every guest had turned their full attention to him before he spoke again. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space without seeming to strain. "I'm William Harrison, and I'm here tonight because of Marcus Chen." I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching panic. Her social instincts recognizing that whatever was about to happen was completely beyond her control. Around the room, I could see guests exchanging confused glances, trying to place the name Harrison, trying to understand why this quiet, authoritative man had just transformed their elegant party into something else entirely. Director Harrison's eyes found mine across the room, and I saw something in them that I had never seen before in all our years of professional interaction. Not just respect, not just recognition, but something warmer, something that looked almost like paternal pride. 3 months ago, he continued, his voice steady and clear, Marcus Chen prevented what would have been the most devastating terrorist attack on American soil since September 11th. He spent 18 months undercover, in a network of extremists, 18 months where he couldn't contact his family, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't live anything resembling a normal life. The silence in the room deepened, became something tangible. I watched my sister's face transform as she began to understand, watched my father's expression shift from his usual careful blankness to something I couldn't quite identify. Only my mother remained frozen, her face a mask of perfect composure that I recognized as her last line of defense against information she didn't want to process. The intelligence he gathered, Director Harrison went on, prevented the simultaneous bombing of 4 major transportation hubs that would have killed thousands of innocent people. The network he infiltrated was planning coordinated attacks in New York, Washington, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Because of Marcus Chen's courage, because of his sacrifice, those attacks never happened. I closed my eyes briefly, remembering those 18 months. The weight of a false identity so complete that sometimes I forgot who I really was. The constant fear of discovery. The knowledge that one wrong word, one slip in accent or gesture, could mean not just my death, but the deaths of everyone counting on the intelligence I was gathering. The way I had to watch potential atrocities being planned and do nothing, say nothing, just smile and nod and gather information while my soul screamed in protest. There had been moments during that operation when I wondered if anyone would ever know what I had sacrificed, what I had endured. Moments when the isolation became so complete that I questioned whether I still existed outside of the fabricated identity I wore like armor. I had missed my grandfather's funeral, had been unreachable when my sister graduated from law school, had spent Christmas alone in a safe house in Prague while my family celebrated at home, probably relieved by my absence. The President of the United States, Director Harrison continued, had personally commended Marcus Chen for his service. The intelligence community considers him one of our most valuable assets, a man whose dedication and skill have saved more lives than most people will ever know. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way perception can change in an instant, when people are forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The man they had been treating as an embarrassment, as a family burden to be managed and minimized, was suddenly someone else entirely. My Aunt Patricia looked as though she had swallowed something unpleasant. Her face had gone pale, and she kept glancing between me and Director Harrison, as if she couldn't quite process the connection. The family friends who had spent years making polite conversation about my desk work were staring at me with expressions ranging from awe to confusion, to something that might have been shame. But it was my parents' faces that held my attention. My father looked stunned, his usual composed demeanor cracking to reveal something raw and uncertain beneath. For the first time in years, he was looking at me not with disappointment or careful distance, but with what appeared to be recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in decades. My mother's reaction was more complex. Her face had gone through several transformations as Director Harrison spoke, moving from confusion to understanding, to what looked like genuine shock. The careful social mask she wore at events like this had slipped, revealing something vulnerable and uncertain that I hadn't seen since childhood. Director Harrison wasn't finished. "I'm here tonight," he said, "because I learned that Marcus has been asked not to attend his own sister's engagement party, that the family he has risked everything to protect considers his presence an embarrassment." His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it now. The quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. "I want everyone in this room to understand something," he continued. "Marcus Chen is an American hero, not the kind who gets parades or medals pinned to his chest in public ceremonies, but the kind whose sacrifices happen in shadows, whose victories can never be celebrated because acknowledging them would compromise ongoing operations and endanger other lives." I felt something breaking open inside my chest, a knot of tension and grief that I had carried for so long it had become part of my anatomy. For years, I had told myself that their rejection didn't matter, that the work was its own reward, that I didn't need their understanding or approval. But standing there, listening to Director Harrison speak, I realized how desperately I had wanted them to see me, to understand that the distance between us wasn't because I had chosen strangers over family, but because I had chosen to protect everyone, including them. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked at me with an expression of such profound regret that it made my throat tight. She took a step toward me, then another, and suddenly she was across the room, wrapping her arms around me in the kind of fierce hug we hadn't shared since we were children. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry I didn't understand." Director Harrison's voice cut through the emotional moment with professional precision. "The reason I know about tonight's preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Situation is that Marcus listed his family as emergency contacts in his personnel file. When he didn't report for a mandatory debriefing yesterday, we called to locate him. His mother informed my office that Marcus was, quote, no longer welcome at family functions, and suggested we, quote, find someone else to bother with his work problems. The words hit my mother like physical blows. Her face went white, then red, and I watched her realize that her casual dismissal of a call from the Central Intelligence Agency had just been revealed to a room full of her closest friends and family members. The woman who prided herself on her social grace, who had built her identity around maintaining perfect appearances, had just been exposed as someone who had hung up on the director of the CIA because she couldn't be bothered with her son's work problems. My father stepped forward, his movement uncertain but deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd heard it in years, stripped of the professional authority he usually carried. "Marcus," he said, and stopped, as if the words he needed didn't exist in any language he knew. Director Harrison checked his watch, a gesture that somehow conveyed both the preciousness of his time and his willingness to spend it here, in this room, making this point. "I have a dinner with the Secretary of Defense in 30 minutes, he said. "But I wanted to come here personally to tell you all something that Marcus would never tell you himself." He turned to look at me directly, and for a moment the professional distance dropped away entirely. 3 weeks ago, when that operation concluded successfully, Marcus Chen submitted his resignation from the Central Intelligence Agency. After 12 years of exemplary service, after sacrificing more than any of us had the right to ask, he decided he was done. Do you know why? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but powerful. No one answered, but I could see understanding beginning to dawn on several faces. "Because," Director Harrison said quietly, "he told me he was tired of living a life where the people who mattered most to him treated his service like a shameful secret. He said he wanted to find work that his family could be proud of, something they could discuss at dinner parties without changing the subject." The words were like a mirror, held up to every conversation we'd had over the past several years, every deflection and dismissal, every time they had reduced my career to government work or policy analysis, because the truth was too complicated for their social circles. I hadn't realized I was crying until Sarah handed me her handkerchief, the silk square embroidered with her initials in pale blue thread. The tears weren't from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, finally being understood by the people whose opinion had shaped me more than I'd ever wanted to admit. Director Harrison straightened his jacket, preparing to leave. "I came here tonight because Marcus Chen deserves better than to be treated like a stranger at his own sister's engagement party. He deserves a family that understands what they have in him, what he has sacrificed for all of us." He nodded once to me, a gesture of respect between colleagues, and then addressed the room one final time. "Congratulations on your engagement, Miss Chen. You're getting married into a family that includes one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to know." As he turned to leave, the room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the stunned quiet that had followed his initial request for attention, but something deeper, heavier, with recognition and regret, and the weight of revelations that couldn't be taken back. My mother approached slowly, her usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. When she reached me, she stopped just close enough that I could see the tears gathering in her eyes, the careful composure finally cracking to reveal the woman underneath. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I didn't know." I looked at her, this woman who had raised me, who had shaped my earliest understanding of love and acceptance and belonging. For the first time in years, I saw not the mother who had rejected me, but the person who had simply been afraid of a world she couldn't understand, threatened by a version of her son that didn't fit into the neat categories of her carefully constructed life. "I know," I said softly. "I know you didn't." And in that moment, surrounded by the fragments of assumptions that had just been shattered, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of it. The recognition that some distances are built not from malice but from fear, and that sometimes the only way to bridge them is to finally tell the truth no matter how long it takes for someone to listen. The reception that followed Director Harrison's departure felt like walking through a different world. The same crystal chandeliers cast the same fractured light across the same white tablecloths, but everything else had fundamentally changed. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter now, more thoughtful, punctuated by glances in my direction that carried a weight they'd never held before. My father approached me near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, his steps careful and deliberate. He carried 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to me with a gesture that somehow felt more significant than it should have. We stood side by side, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, neither of us speaking for several minutes. "The Prague assignment," he said finally, his voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. "That Christmas 3 years ago when you didn't come home." Your mother said you'd called with some excuse about work obligations. I sipped the whiskey, feeling the burns settle in my chest. There was no call, Dad. I was in a safe house, maintaining cover. I couldn't contact anyone for 6 months. He nodded slowly, processing information that recontextualized years of assumptions. We thought you were avoiding us. Your mother was convinced you'd found some excuse to skip Christmas because family dinners were too boring for your sophisticated Washington lifestyle. The misunderstanding was so complete, so perfectly inverted from reality that I almost laughed. Instead, I felt a deep sadness for all the years we'd spent misreading each other's signals, building resentment on foundations of pure fiction. I thought about you every day, I said. About what you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you missed me being there. The hardest part of that assignment wasn't the danger or the isolation. It was knowing that you all probably preferred Christmas without me. My father's reflection in the window showed an expression I'd rarely seen before. Genuine remorse mixed with something that looked like pride. Your mother kept your stocking hung by the fireplace anyway, he said quietly. She never said why, but she did it every year you were gone. Made sure your presents were under the tree until New Year's Day, just in case. This revelation hit me harder than Director Harrison's public vindication had. The image of my mother, who had seemed so eager to distance herself from my career, quietly maintaining the rituals of inclusion even when she believed I had chosen to exclude myself, suggested layers of complexity I'd never considered. Judge Pemberton appeared beside us, his earlier intoxication replaced by an almost childlike curiosity. Marcus, I owe you an apology, he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had sobered up quickly. All those times I tried to get you to talk about your work, I thought you were being modest. I didn't realize you were protecting operational security. I turned to face him, this man who had known my family for decades, who had watched me grow up at countless social gatherings. Judge, you don't owe me anything. You were just being friendly. He shook his head emphatically. No, son. I was being nosy. There's a difference. And after what Director Harrison said tonight, I'm beginning to understand that my curiosity could have put you in real danger. The conversation drew others, family friends, who approached with expressions ranging from awe to embarrassment to genuine concern. Mrs. Whitmore, who had taught me piano lessons as a child, squeezed my hand and whispered that she'd always known I was destined for something important. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, clapped me on the shoulder and said he wished Grandpa Chen could have lived to hear about tonight. But it was the absence of certain conversations that struck me most powerfully. My Aunt Patricia had disappeared entirely, along with several other family members who had been most vocal about their disapproval of my career choices over the years. Their absence spoke volumes about the kind of people they were, the kind who could embrace you when your value was publicly validated, but couldn't find the courage to apologize for years of private dismissal. Sarah found me near the coat check, where I'd retreated to catch my breath and process the evening's revelations. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her expression was determined in a way that reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with, the one who used to defend me against playground bullies with a fierceness that often got her in more trouble than me. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice urgent. About the engagement party invitation. About why Mom said you shouldn't come. I held up a hand to stop her. Sarah, you don't need to explain anything. Tonight is about you and Thomas. About your happiness. That's all that matters. She shook her head, tears threatening again. No, Marcus, you need to know. Thomas asked specifically if you were coming. He wanted to meet you, said he'd heard you worked for the government and thought it sounded fascinating. Mom told him you probably wouldn't be able to make it because of work commitments. The revelation added another layer to the evening's cascade of misunderstandings. My future brother-in-law had been looking forward to meeting me, while I'd been convinced that my presence would embarrass the family in front of Sarah's sophisticated new fiancé. She was trying to protect me, Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. Protect the party, protect her idea of how things should be. But she was wrong, Marcus. She was so wrong. Thomas appeared beside Sarah, tall and confident in the way that comes from a lifetime of privilege, but his expression was humble as he extended his hand to me. Marcus, I'm Thomas Morrison. I've been looking forward to meeting you for months. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and there was genuine warmth in his voice that suggested Sarah had chosen well. "Sarah talks about you constantly," he continued. "She's incredibly proud of you, even if she couldn't always articulate exactly why." Now I understand. We talked for several minutes about mundane things: his work in finance, their wedding plans, his family's place in the Hamptons. Normal conversation, the kind I'd been excluded from for years, but which now felt natural and easy. He asked thoughtful questions about Washington, about what it was like to work in government, but he didn't push for details when I gave deliberately vague answers. As the evening wound down, guests began to drift toward the exit, many stopping to say goodbye with a warmth that felt different from their earlier polite distance. Some pressed business cards into my hand, inviting me to lunches or dinners, suddenly eager to cultivate a relationship they'd previously found awkward or complicated. My mother was the last to approach, after most of the other guests had left. She moved slowly, as if each step required careful consideration, her usual social confidence replaced by something more tentative and uncertain. In the end, I accepted a compromise, a role as a senior consultant that would allow me to contribute to critical operations while maintaining enough flexibility to rebuild the relationships I'd sacrificed over the years. My family didn't become perfect overnight. There were still awkward moments, still conversations that required careful navigation, still assumptions and misunderstandings that needed to be addressed. But there was also something new: effort. Genuine effort to understand, to accept, to bridge the gaps that had seemed insurmountable for so long. Sarah's wedding 6 months later was everything her engagement party should have been: a celebration where I belonged, where my presence added to, rather than complicated, the joy of the occasion. Director Harrison attended as my guest, charming my relatives with stories about intelligence work that revealed nothing classified, but everything important about the nature of service and sacrifice. During the reception, as I watched Sarah dance with her new husband, my mother approached and slipped her arm through mine. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of years of things left unsaid. I looked around the room, at the family that had rejected me and then rediscovered me, at the life I'd built in the shadows and the new possibility of living more openly, more completely. The work would continue, the threats would evolve, the country would need protection from dangers most people would never know existed. But for the first time in years, I wouldn't be facing those challenges alone. I would have a family that understood, even if they couldn't always discuss it, even if there would always be parts of my life that remained classified. They would have a brother, a son, who had chosen to serve something larger than himself, and they would finally understand that this choice hadn't been a rejection of them, but an expression of the values they had actually taught me. Sometimes the greatest victories happen not on battlefields or in intelligence briefings, but in quiet moments when people choose to see each other clearly, to forgive what can be forgiven, and to build something new from the fragments of what was broken. Standing there at my sister's wedding, watching my parents smile at me with genuine pride for the first time in years, I understood that some missions take decades to complete, but they're worth every year of patience it takes to bring them home. 2 years have passed since that evening at the Metropolitan Club, and I'm sitting in my new office in downtown Washington, watching the morning commuters stream past my window like a river of ambition and coffee cups. The space is smaller than what I had at Langley, but it has something my old office never possessed: windows that actually open, natural light that changes with the weather, and the freedom to display photographs on my desk without worrying about security protocols. The picture I'm looking at now shows Sarah's twin daughters, born just 3 months ago, sleeping peacefully in matching pink blankets. My nieces, Emma and Claire, who will grow up knowing their Uncle Marcus not as the mysterious government worker who disappeared for months at a time, but as the man who reads them stories during video calls and promises to teach them Mandarin when they're old enough to appreciate having a secret language. My phone buzzes with a text from my mother. "Dinner Sunday at 6. Dad is making his famous lasagna. Please don't be late this time." The casualness of the message, the assumption that I'll be there, the gentle teasing about my chronic tardiness, all of it represents a normalcy I once thought was permanently lost to me. These weekly dinners have become sacred, a ritual of reconnection that began tentatively and has grown into something neither of us wants to risk by missing. The consulting work I've taken on allows me to choose my assignments, to maintain the intellectual challenge and sense of purpose that drew me to intelligence work, while having enough control over my schedule to show up for the small moments that build a life outside the shadows. Last month, I spent 2 weeks in Berlin analyzing a network of cybersecurity threats that could have destabilized European banking systems. This week, I'm reviewing satellite intelligence about weapons shipments in the Middle East. Next week, I'll be in New York for Emma and Claire's baptism, standing beside Sarah as she introduces her daughters to the extended family that has slowly learned to embrace complexity rather than demand simplicity. The transformation hasn't been uniformly smooth or universally successful. My Aunt Patricia remains carefully distant, offering polite greetings at family gatherings but never quite meeting my eyes. Some bridges, once burned, leave foundations too damaged for rebuilding. Her discomfort with my reintegration into family events speaks to something deeper than social awkwardness, something that suggests she would prefer to maintain the version of reality where I was the family disappointment, rather than confront her own years of dismissive cruelty. But for every relationship that remains fractured, others have deepened in ways I never expected. My father and I have developed a weekly ritual of our own. Saturday morning walks through Meridian Hill Park when I'm in town, conversations that range from international politics to baseball statistics to memories of my childhood that we both remember differently but can now discuss without defensiveness. During one of these walks, he told me about the night Director Harrison called the house looking for me. "Your mother hung up on him," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and lingering disbelief. She thought it was some kind of scam. When he called back and identified himself as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, she told him he was very good at impersonating government officials, but that she wasn't falling for it. The image of my mother, protective of her family's privacy to the point of hanging up on the head of the CIA, would have been infuriating 2 years ago. Now it strikes me as somehow endearing. Evidence of the fierce loyalty that had always been there but had gotten twisted into rejection when she couldn't understand the world I inhabited. "He called a third time," my father continued, "and spoke to me directly. His voice, Marcus, the authority in it, the way he talked about you. I realized we'd been wrong about everything, but I didn't know how to fix it." These revelations continue to surface during our conversations, small details that recontextualize years of misunderstanding. The Christmas gifts they continued buying for me even when I couldn't come home, stored in my childhood bedroom closet like offerings to a ghost. The newspaper clippings my mother collected about intelligence successes, never knowing if I was involved but hoping perhaps that I was. The quiet pride my father felt when colleagues mentioned having heard impressive things about someone named Chen in government circles. Pride he never learned how to express because he didn't know how to reconcile it with his confusion about my chosen life. Thomas has become an unexpected ally in this process of family reconstruction. His background in finance, his comfort with complex systems, and long-term strategic thinking seems to help him understand both the necessity of my work and the toll it takes. During family dinners, he often steers conversations toward topics that allow me to participate fully, asking about travel experiences or cultural observations that let me share stories without revealing classified information. He's also become a bridge between the person I was before my intelligence career and the person I am now. At Sarah's birthday party last month, he showed everyone a photo from their honeymoon in Prague, taken in a cafe near the Old Town Square. "Marcus recommended this place," he said casually. "Said he'd spent some time there and that they had the best coffee in the city." The simplicity of the moment, the way he presented my knowledge of Prague as nothing more than a helpful travel tip rather than evidence of months spent living under deep cover, represented exactly the kind of integration I'd never thought possible. My expertise became a gift to family members rather than a barrier between us. The most profound change, though, has been in my relationship with my mother. The woman who once couldn't discuss my career without visible discomfort now asks thoughtful questions about my current projects, couching her curiosity in terms of general interest in world events. She's learned to read between the lines of my deliberately vague answers, understanding that I can't really discuss that means the work is important, rather than that I'm being evasive or secretive. Last Christmas, she surprised me with a gift that revealed how much attention she'd been paying to details I thought she'd never noticed. It was a leather-bound journal, expensive and substantial, with my initials embossed on the cover. "For your thoughts," she said simply. The ones you can write down anyway. Inside the front cover, she'd written a note in her careful handwriting. For Marcus, who has always carried more than his share of the world's weight. May you find space here for the thoughts that are yours alone. With love and profound respect, Mom. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to collect myself after reading it, overwhelmed by the recognition that she had finally understood something fundamental about the burden of classified knowledge, about the loneliness of carrying secrets that could never be shared. The journal sits on my desk now, half filled with observations about the work I can't discuss elsewhere, reflections on the peculiar challenges of a career spent in service of people who must never know they've been served. It's become a space for processing the ethical complexities of intelligence work, the weight of decisions that affect thousands of lives, the personal cost of professional success measured in metrics that can never be made public. My current assignment involves analyzing intelligence about a terrorist network operating across 3 continents, work that requires the same depth of analysis and cultural understanding that made me valuable to the agency. But the difference now is that I go home each evening to an apartment where I can cook dinner while talking to Sarah on the phone, where I can plan weekend visits with my parents, where I can maintain the relationships that give meaning to the protection I help provide. Director Harrison and I meet quarterly for what he calls professional development, but which feels more like conversations between colleagues who have found a way to balance service with personal fulfillment. During our most recent meeting, he mentioned that several other senior analysts had requested similar consulting arrangements, inspired by what he called the Chen model of maintaining expertise while reclaiming personal agency. You've shown us something important, he said during our last conversation. That we don't have to choose between loving this country and loving the people in our lives. That service doesn't require self-destruction. The observation has stayed with me, particularly as I've watched other intelligence professionals struggle with the same tensions that once threatened to tear my life apart. The work will always demand sacrifice, will always require a level of secrecy that complicates relationships with people who live entirely in the open world. But it doesn't have to demand everything, doesn't have to consume every aspect of identity and connection. Sarah's daughters are too young to understand what their uncle does for work, but they won't grow up with the confusion and distance that characterized my relationship with my own family. They'll know me as someone who travels frequently for important work that helps keep people safe, someone who brings them interesting gifts from foreign cities, someone who speaks funny languages and can teach them words that make their parents laugh. When they're older, when they can understand nuance and complexity, they'll learn that Uncle Marcus chose a career that required him to put the safety of strangers ahead of his own comfort, that he spent years of his life becoming someone else so that other people could remain themselves. They'll understand that service takes many forms, that heroism often happens in silence, that the most important victories are the ones that prevent tragedies, rather than celebrate triumphs. But first, they'll simply know that they are loved by someone who chose to build a life that had room for them in it, someone who learned that the greatest intelligence failure is losing track of what you're fighting to protect. The work continues, will always continue. There are threats emerging that require exactly the kind of analysis I've spent years learning to provide. Networks of extremists planning attacks that could kill thousands of innocent people. Weapons programs developing capabilities that could destabilize entire regions. The world remains dangerous, remains in need of people willing to stand between civilization and chaos, willing to carry secrets that weigh more than most people can imagine. But I carry those secrets now with the knowledge that there are people in my life who understand the weight, even if they can't know the details, who support the mission even if they can't discuss the methods, who love the person I've become, rather than mourning the person I might have been, if I'd chosen a simpler path. 3 nights ago, my father called to tell me that Mrs. Chen from down the street had asked about me during their weekly neighborhood walk. She said she'd heard from someone that you work for the CIA, he said, and I braced myself for the familiar discomfort of having my cover blown in suburban social circles. Instead, his voice carried something I'd never heard before. Pride. I told her that I couldn't discuss the details of your work, but that I'd never been more proud of anyone in my life. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it represented decades of growth, years of learning to see each other clearly. My father, who once couldn't find words to describe what I did for a living, had learned to protect my operational security while claiming me publicly as his son. My mother, who once treated my career like a family embarrassment, now deflects curious questions with the grace of someone who understands that some truths are too important to share carelessly. The evening light is fading outside my office window, and it's time to head home to the apartment I've learned to think of as a refuge rather than simply a place to sleep between assignments. Tonight I'll cook dinner while video calling with Sarah and the twins. We'll catch up on news that I can discuss without security concerns. We'll read fiction instead of intelligence reports. We'll live for a few hours in the world I help protect, rather than the shadows where protection is planned. Tomorrow there will be new threats to analyze, new networks to understand, new ways that enemies of democracy and freedom will attempt to harm innocent people. There will be long days in secure facilities, encrypted communications with assets in dangerous places, briefings with officials whose decisions will ripple across continents. But tonight, there will be lasagna with my parents. Stories about the twins' latest developmental milestones, planning for Sarah's birthday party next month. The ordinary magic of a life that has room for both service and love, both sacrifice and connection. I close the journal, lock the classified files in their designated secure storage, and turn off the lights in my office. The work will be here tomorrow, as urgent and important as ever. But so will the relationships that give that work meaning. The family that has learned to see me clearly. The life I've built in the space between the shadows and the light. Walking to my car, I think about Director Harrison's words from that evening at the Metropolitan Club. We don't leave our own behind. It took me years to understand that the people we serve include the people we love, that protecting strangers is meaningless if we lose connection to the relationships that teach us what protection means. The intelligence community will always need people willing to sacrifice for the greater good, willing to carry burdens that can't be shared, willing to make decisions that others will never know were necessary. But it also needs people who remember why that sacrifice matters, who maintain connections to the world they're fighting to preserve, who understand that the ultimate failure of intelligence isn't missing a threat, but losing sight of what makes life worth protecting. I drive home through the streets of Washington, past monuments to leaders who made their own difficult choices about service and sacrifice, past buildings where other analysts are working late into the night on threats that may never become public knowledge, past families enjoying dinner together, unaware of how many people work in secret to keep their ordinary evenings safe and peaceful. At a red light, I text my mother. On my way, looking forward to Dad's lasagna. Her response comes immediately. Drive safely. We love you. 3 words that took decades to mean what they should have meant from the beginning. 3 words that represent not just personal reconciliation but professional validation, the understanding that the work I chose was worthy of love rather than shame, that the person I became deserved acceptance rather than rejection. The light turns green, and I drive toward home, toward family, toward the life I learned to build in the space between service and connection. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to protect people who will never know they needed protecting. Tonight brings lasagna and laughter and the profound satisfaction of work that matters, relationships that endure, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important mission is simply learning how to be loved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.